What's up, everybody? You are listening to the Credentials Unscripted podcast. I'm your host, Matt Sterenberg, and we've got another phenomenal episode for you today. We're talking about skills-based hiring and some of the initiatives that states are undertaking. We're talking with Amanda Winters, Program Director at the National Governors Association, and she's got a lot of great insight because she's working with these states that are thinking about public sector jobs and removing the degree as a requirement. But what does that entail, and what does that mean for the ecosystem? How do we actually then, focus on skills and competencies rather than just bachelor's degree required? So, a great conversation. And the thing I love about Amanda is that she's a realist, and I think she's also willing to take a critical eye to these things, even though she's very supportive of it. So she's always thinking about it from someone that doesn't live this day to day. And what does it mean in practical terms for someone who maybe doesn't have a degree? How do we actually get this ecosystem to work for everybody, for equity, and for income mobility and economic mobility? So really good conversation. I like the lens that she takes, willing to acknowledge some of the challenges of it, but also being a positive force behind these efforts. So without further ado, let's get to our conversation with Amanda. Here we go. I'm here with Amanda Winters, Program Director at the National Governors Association. Amanda, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks. I'm excited to be here. I feel like I can share all of my unvarnished opinions, which I have many of. So I'm ready.
Yes, completely unscripted. You can go wherever you want. Tell us a little bit more about what you do at the National Governors Association.
Yeah, I feel pretty lucky most of the time. It's a cool position. I sit in the Center for Best Practices for the National Governors Association. And what a lot of people don't know about us is that we're actually two organizations smushed together. So we have the association side, which has state dues, and we do advocacy on the Hill, that kind of stuff. And then the Center for Best Practices is essentially the policy shop or think tank for governors. So we have 13 different policy areas that stretch across cybersecurity, homeland security, health, energy. So all the different things that governors' offices are thinking about. So thinking about their priorities as executive of the state. I sit over post-secondary. And the way I have sort of framed this since I started, I actually spun up the post-secondary program about 6 years ago. And the NGA Center had before that focused primarily on workforce as sort of its anything after high school strategy. And they got some feedback from states saying, hey, there's this whole section of policy that we feel like we want to dig into a little bit deeper. So I was brought on. I was previously at the Illinois Board of Higher Education, and I was brought on to create a portfolio around post-secondary education. We're entirely soft money funded, so I go out and talk to funders about what states are interested in, and they invest in projects that are focused on state policy development or implementation. And so as we're talking today, I can talk a little bit more about what some of those projects look like and how I'm learning about some of these national policy spaces based on what the states are implementing right now in sort of the credentials and skills space. But I think the way we frame my policy area is, and I feel lucky to have the flexibility to sort of figure out what my perspective is on portfolio development, but really it's anything after high school that leads to economic mobility pathways. So over the last several years, we've seen a lot of emphasis on, shorter term credentials, stackable credentials. Recently, it's been, very much skills pathways. So I try to stay out of those spaces that already have a really strong voice. For instance, we're not purely higher education. We purposely chose post-secondary as a term because it's more inclusive of any, pathway. Whereas we have great partners like SHIO, who are thinking about, leveraging higher education pathways and some really specific sort of financing and data implementation. And they're great partners of ours. And then also just, folks like the community college, the Association of Community College Trustees is a huge partner of ours. So we sort of have a network of partners that dig in a little bit deeper, but we try to create an umbrella of, what does post-secondary look like from a governor's perspective. How are you getting people into jobs, moving them into spaces where they have more career mobility, economic mobility, and you're getting more people, engaged in our economy. So that's why some of my projects take a much broader view than some of the more specific higher ed partners that we engage with. So we'll dig into that, I know, a little bit in the credential conversation today. But that's sort of why some of the skills conversations is falling under post-secondary rather than maybe workforce and economic development at our organization.
I really like that framing. When you explain it like that, it makes a lot of sense, because I think we often try to create like this binary where it's like, are you on a college path or a career path?
Yeah, I
And
hate that.
I feel like this is a theme that's been coming up lately in all my conversations, where it's like, well, actually, there could be workforce certificates that you also get college credit for, or I might go to the workforce and then college. I feel like we have to get away from, this, are you on this track or this track? And then, and I think that's the benefit of the skills and competencies conversation is it allows us to map these things to each other. Like, what does workforce mean for higher ed and what does higher ed mean for workforce? But let's start at kind of the problem statement. What you have a big initiative on skills-based hiring. Mm-hmm. Skills and competencies, everyone's talking about them, but like, what are we really trying to solve with skills-based hiring or skill-based hiring? What are we trying to accomplish?
Yeah, I will say we came to this topic in a little bit of a circuitous route, but we are following the lead of governors who have stepped out and removed bachelor's degree requirements in over a dozen states for public sector roles. But we've been engaged in the skills conversation for a while now. We started with an exploratory, first of all, a credential sort of focused piece of work that we had, thinking about stackable credentials and how states are thinking about quality and the different mechanisms in which they fund those quality pathways. But then there was an exploration of learning and employment records, which is sort of a subset of the skills conversation. It's the more technology focused piece of this work. So how do you capture the skills and how do you move them from place to place? And how do they get valued at each of those different spots where they land? So we started an exploration there. We have some states who are doing some really exciting work. Shout out to Alabama and Arkansas and Colorado. So some states that are really leaning in to a holistic view of skills, which includes the technological aspect of, the modern day movement of some of our data between systems.
And this is where a lot of the standards bodies, they want to be able to transfer all these skills, competencies, learning outcomes. Let's make it data so that we can send it back and forth. And we need to all agree on what the standard is for transferring this data back and forth. Is that a good summation?
Yeah, it is. And I think I do not pretend to be an expert on data standards. In fact, no offense to my colleagues who are in this space, but it puts me to sleep to talk about data standers. I will just acknowledge, I think they're important.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that's what I do. Yeah.
It's on you then. Because for me, I just say I can acknowledge that data standards are important in this conversation. Yeah. That's as far as I go. Like, I get it. Cool. And then all the people who are smarter than me in data stuff should figure out what that looks like. But that was a sort of our first foray into some of these more structured conversations around skills. And then we've moved recently, because of these gubernatorial moves to remove the degree requirement, we've moved in a direction that really focuses on the public sector as an employer, which to me is super exciting. First of all, governor's leading, always great for the role that I'm in. But also, once you start to look at the data in almost every state, and I say almost because I have not dug into absolutely every state, and so I want to leave space for me being wrong in one state or the other. But in almost every state, the public sector is the biggest employer. And in many states, it's 1 out of 5 people in the state are employed by state or local government. And that's huge. And yet, when we do these conversations about employer engagement, across all of the work we do in education and workforce, public sector is almost never at the table as an employer. They're always at the table thinking about pathways and funding and data, but never really focusing in on their role as, a talent pipeline developer. And I think that that's a cool switch that we're making with this project, in addition to expanding the conversation about what skills-based hiring is. So I'll jump into a little bit about what the project looks like, and just emphasize a few things that are happening right now. We have 24 states and territories who are engaged with us right now and are leaning into a conversation around skills-based hiring. This has become sort of a really focused HR and culture change conversation in a way that I did not necessarily expect, which is cool. It's exciting for us to be able to partner with states in this really concrete way. But what it's showing me too is that this connects to our earlier conversations on learning and employment records around sort of, what's the data that needs to flow between agencies and organizations in order for people to more easily move based on their skills through some of these systems. But also, it's the credential conversation is, I think, critical here. But it's easy to get lost in sort of the conversation around skills-based hiring. Shorter term credentials, stackable credentials are proxies for skills in the same way that larger,
a degree. Yeah.
So it's just really broken down into different pieces. But I think that we've been talking more about individual skills when we're talking about skills-based hiring, like how do we sort of capture all these things learned in these different spaces, and not really thinking about the importance of proxies in the flow of information for hiring processes. And what scares me the most about this is in the past couple of years, where we were talking about learning and employment record stuff. One of the things that got highlighted for me through some of the research that had happened, specifically some of my friends and colleagues at Northeastern University did some research that showed that HR IT systems were not ingesting digital credentials, and that they weren't planning to in the near term. And so I think, okay, what are we doing? What are we creating on the education and training side? Like, where is it going? Is it just swirling between education and workforce people, and we're excited that we created this system to look at this data and feel good about ourselves? Or is this actually going to help people who hadn't gotten access to jobs before get in the pool of job applicants for jobs? So opening up opportunity. I think my go-to phrase for all of this work is, I don't want to work on creating pathways for people who already have pathways. If we're doing that, then it's meaningless to me. I just did this weird administrative exercise, patted myself on the back for data for people who already had, the opportunity, getting additional opportunities. I really want to see, does this change anything? And I think that's what states are focusing on now too, is we want to get different people, more people, different kinds of people into some of these pipelines for our jobs. And I'm focused on how that can be a lever for, to hopefully prompt the private sector also to be more open and transparent about their strategies for skills-based hiring, and how we can speak together across states and private sector about, our roles in talent pipeline development and the advancement, engagement, and upskilling of different types of talent sources.
So you highlighted something I think is really interesting. We take the degree away as a requirement. Great. But what you highlighted is, are we just going to replace it with something else? Like all the skills and competencies that you would earn on your way to a degree. It's just we're closing the door in the same way that we were before. So how do we actually focus on the skills and competencies that are actually required? But then how do we create that pathway for people that were being denied because they didn't have a bachelor's and associates or whatever else? The thing that always gets me, you highlighted it, is the adoption piece. Where does it begin? For the HR information systems, do they have to take the lead? But I could see if you were in their shoes, they'd be like, no one is going to send us these. Why are we going to change our software and our workflow when these aren't available? But at the same point, it's like kind of the chicken and the egg. Like, well, I'm not going to create it if no one's asking for it, right? If the employer, so it is a very difficult. Adoption is the name of the game. Like, there's ideas are cheap, technology could be built, right? How do we get this like wide scale adoption? And that's why I think it's cool that the public sector is leading, because you have more control over the public sector. You can actually insinuate change, especially if the governor says, hey, this is something we really want to do. Here's how we're going to run it. So I think it's really cool that you're leading in that way. What barriers do you see?
Oof.
And what are the challenges? Like, if people are sitting at home going, okay, it's obviously not this easy, but what have you encountered?
Yeah, so there's several things, and this is not against, of course, any of the states that are launching this work or any of the private sector partners specifically. This is just sort of general things that I see. First of all, I think one of the dangers that continues to pop up is that by emphasizing skills-based hiring strategies, we're going to create a bifurcated hiring system. We're going to have traditional hires that come in through our regular, systems and have the degrees, from the big universities that we've always gotten applicants from. And then we're going to have the skills-based hires. And in some early data around a specific sector, when we were talking to our partners over at LinkedIn, they were sharing some early data saying when you remove the bachelor's degree requirement, wages dropped for those roles. And so I'm not saying that that's going to be the trend across all, but it is a red flag. It is a flag that says, hey, we need to be intentional about how we create these opportunities. And it can't just be, okay, if these people, from, I don't know, American University get a job here, they're going to get paid here. But if we bring up somebody through a skills pathway and remove the degree requirement for that role, they will do the same job and get paid less. We don't want to create inequity through and cement a lot of existing inequity through whatever we're trying to build. And I think that's a danger. It's a challenge that we need to be aware of.
Yeah, where the whole purpose was we want people that don't have a bachelor's degree to get access to like the wages of someone that has a bachelor's degree because they have the same skills required. And it's like, unintended consequence. Yeah, that's interesting.
Another challenge is, and I come from a background of having worked at a university system. I worked with a state regulatory system that oversaw university and college systems. But we're avoiding talking to faculty about a lot of this stuff in the early stages. We're like, we'll create essentially an alternative to talking to faculty about some of this stuff, which, I get it. They are their own culture within academia. Shared governance, super important. Not going to say I don't like it. But I think people think it's hard to work with faculty on some of these things, so they don't do it. But in the end, it does a disservice to the learner. That's who it does the disservice to, is that you haven't talked to faculty and engaged them in a conversation about this. Therefore, they might not understand the information you're putting out around skills. They might not value those within their own credit-bearing systems and award credit where it's appropriate because they just haven't been engaged in a meaningful way. So my worry is that we'll create this whole other language that sits outside of our education systems and say, everybody should value this information. This should help you in your educational pathway, but you haven't engaged faculty in this. And I learned a lesson early on in the work that I did, that faculty at a university or college are the ones who award the degrees. It's not the president. It's not the administration of the school. It's the faculty. And if they're not on board and leaning in and engaging, even though it's hard sometimes to navigate those systems, it is a critical role that I think many of the conversations are bypassing because it's difficult. And again, the people who are going to be hurt from this are the learner, in that they will have a lack of mobility around their skills. So we're going to do this administrative exercise of listing out a bunch of skills. And what if nobody cares about that list?
Yeah.
What if employers don't care? What if other educational institutions don't care? So I feel like we're doing sort of this test on learners and workers of like, here's this cool platform, and we made a bunch of badges for you, and we did some really pretty like emojis in it, and you can go in there and like play around with it, but it does nothing for you. And that's one of my biggest fears too, is that we're going to pat ourselves on the back as sort of like the DC space around, skills credentials, pat ourselves on the back and saying, well, we created all these platforms, and now they just have to use them. And we're going to say we did a great thing for equity, when really nobody got any concrete outcomes. And I feel like we're not set up to measure what those outcomes are. There's so much gray area and murky area around the language of skills. And so we just sit at this space where, if we're not intentional, this could just be just a cluster. And right now, I think there's a few key groups that are trying to shine a light on some of these areas. We hope that we are one of them, sitting alongside states trying to do this. But right now, I think we're at a turning point where this could go well, or we could start to see advancement in the right direction, or this could just be all a waste of time.
The expression that Nick Moore often uses, he's or was, when I spoke with him at the governor's office in Alabama, he uses the phrase wooden nickels. We want to make sure we're not giving people wooden nickels. Basically, something that we're saying, this is currency that can't be transacted for anything. But to your point, like, if this is we have to prove that, number one, the outcomes are better for learners or people with skills, like that I have access to more opportunity. And then from the employer side, we have to prove out that you're unlocking this other source of talent, or that the people that you get are better than the people you were getting before. That's a hard challenge. It's always difficult to track outcomes, and how do we know we're successful? How are you going to do that? Because obviously you're on the policy side. A huge task for you is going, how do we report back? States want this information. What are the guideposts we're going to hit along the way in these skills-based hiring initiatives?
Yeah, so that's been a huge challenge, but I think it's one of the best challenges for us to tackle, because one of the things that states can do is, in any of their initiatives, is gather the data. And then at the end of that gathering of the data, be like, look, this worked, or this didn't work, and we're going to stop doing it, or we're going to change course. And so around this, we've been talking to the states that we're working with about what should the metrics be. NGA is not going to tell states what their metrics should be. We're going to talk with them, especially their HR professionals, which is a new group of state officials for me to engage with. I'm so excited to get to know so many of them. There is just if people were not aware, because I was not aware, there's a group called the National Association of State Personnel Executives, NASPE, which is the national organization for the people who sit at these CHRO positions, these chief HR positions. And then they also have what is essentially their SHRM, which is called PASHRA, which is the Public Sector HR Association. I believe I got that right.
That's a lot of acronyms. That's a lot of if you're following at home, just Google.
I know.
And there's an organization for everything, is what I've learned in my job. But anyways.
So I'm half of my job right now is getting to know these people and figuring out what their perspective is, and also figuring out how the governor's office can leverage them. These professionals who sit in your administration, how can they help implement your vision? This doesn't sit in education. This doesn't sit in the workforce. This sits in, offices of personnel. This, sits in their, offices of management and budget. So this is a new space for us to explore, and a new sort of lever for governors that they're really, I think, figuring out how these people can be a part of their larger priority and vision rather than just mainly focused on, compliance or process. They really are have to be a part of the strategic plan development, for talent development within certain states. And we're seeing some states really lean into that. And it's exciting to see. And I think what's great about the public sector too is that they have to be transparent. There are laws, you have to be able to see into all these processes that states are doing. And that's great because a bunch of the stuff in the private sector is under a proprietary black box. So they can just, they have the freedom to say, trust me, I'm doing skills-based hiring. But they don't have to release any of the information about what they're doing or how they're assessing skills. Whereas a state, the public sector has to. They have to say, okay, here's the process of what we're doing. Here's what we do first, and this is what's happening, and here's our data. And in most cases, like me as a state worker, you could Google my salary in any of the jobs I was in. It was sort of an excess of transparency. And I think that's what's needed right now in the skills space is what are you trying? We know we don't have best practices yet. We have promising practices. We have, cool opportunities, but tied to that is the data. And so we've been leaning in a bit with Burning Glass Institute as a data partner for us. They're doing a landscape scan of essentially where states are right now. And this is not meant to, shame any states for not doing certain things. This is just essentially to say, how can we measure into the future what's happening on a state level around skills-based hiring efforts? So where are we at now? Specifically, we're very interested in those states who have executive orders around removal of the bachelor's degree requirement, but also there's lots of other states who don't have that kind of move that are also implementing some really cool efforts around skills-based hiring. So we're trying to see where are we at now so that in a year, we can say this is some of the progress. And I think in these early stages, it's important to point out that some of this progress is going to be policy development. It's not necessarily going to be like 1,000 people got hired in this new pathway. It's going to be like these policies changed. This was implemented. This was reduced. This was increased. It's going to be very like early stage. And I feel like we need to celebrate those and not look for the things that are actually going to come 2 or 3 years from now.
Well, put yourself in the shoes of someone who doesn't talk about credentialing all day.
Yeah.
And okay, bachelor's degree not required. I don't have my bachelor's degree, let's say. Okay, great. But they list out all of these skills and competencies that are required for the role. Well, how do I demonstrate that? Well, for a normal person, they've never heard of micro-credential or other types of badges or what. So how do I get those? How do I prove that I know that? There are so many different layers to this where, again, we're so close to it that I think we sometimes are like, all right, we're solving one problem. It's like plugging one hole and the water comes out somewhere else. It's like, yeah. And for those people that I did just Google Amanda's salary when she was a state employee, and it is a lot. I mean, it was a lot. I mean, for those of you listening, it was exorbitant. No,
I love it.
That's true. But yeah, that's like this. It is a newer conversation. I think we have I think a healthy impatience with it to a degree where we're like, we got to move fast. Like we've got these problems to solve. But I look at it as almost like a progression of the Lumina Foundation came out with we want 60% of adults with a credential by, 2030. And that was kind of the start in my mind of like this intense focus because we know that credentials matter, they're currency. Mm-hmm. And then we're kind of shifting to, well, is it the credential itself or what you learn when you're obtaining that credential, right? And I think that, okay, that makes sense, but it's just a shift now. And I think that's why we've had this system for so long is because if you say you have your bachelor's, PhD, or you went to Harvard, it's a little lazy in a sense, but I just make assumptions about who you are and what you know. And sometimes that's just, I'm trying to hire someone really quick, right? I don't want to do a lot of work. And that's why we've persisted in this system for so long and why it's also so difficult to change.
Yeah. And I will say proxies are proxies for a reason.
Yeah.
They make things easy. It's not just saying something's a proxy doesn't mean it's bad. So I want to, and every time we talk to employers, especially private sector employers, but I'm sure public sector feel the same. They say, don't make our assessment process any harder. They're like, how can we get to some of these things without you overcomplicating the process? And I feel like on the education policy side, we just want to create all these freaking signals for like, oh, this is like, nobody understands what that is. So you're going to create it. You're going to feel real good about yourself. But when it goes out past your bubble of sort of your, in the weeds conversations, nobody else understands what that is, and they don't care anything about it. And we have to understand that we are battling, at the same time we're trying to open up these doors, we are battling sort of the power of the reputational element of a bachelor's degree, or the reputational element of, graduating from a certain institution. That's not going to go away. And I mean, I'm not saying it necessarily should. I don't. Yes, I think there's undue like emphasis on that as a part of hiring decisions, but we have to understand a lot of these are people-driven decisions, and it's based on what their experience is, what they know, and that's something that's not going to change overnight. So it's just like when we're talking about credentials. What I found is, as we're talking about what people mean by quality credentials, we can set up whatever quality frameworks we want. But when it comes right down to it, if you have a micro credential from the University of Michigan Ford School, people don't care the competencies you learned in it. They know that it was from the Ford School and that they value that institution. They think that that's a reputable institution. And if it's from another training provider, may have taught you way more than Michigan did and that micro credential, but they don't know who that group is. So the valuing and the reputational element of this is, I think, key for the conversation. And we can't expect that just to be like, oh, well, these are a higher quality and it fits with our framework better, because that's what the framework people sound like. Yeah. And then we're just supposed to go with it. And like, no, the reality is people don't know what that means. And so we have to really take this step by step. And hopefully people will start to focus on the skills and competencies that sit behind some of these proxies. But right now, their access point is what they know. And it's what they know about the providers. It's what they know from their experience. So that culture change element of this is going to take years. And it's not an easily surmountable problem. It's something that we'll have to grapple with. And I think, states have a lot of opportunity to lean in there and try to, dig into skills as opposed to sort of the degrees as proxies. But I think a place where we have to start is some of these recognized maybe associate's degree earners that have, they have a degree. They can get in there credentials that are from recognized providers. We have to start there, figure out what the decision points are related to some of those credentials. And then we can start talking about these skills that are maybe self-attested skills, or things that they've earned in another position that are somehow validated by other employers or through a work-based learning experience. So there's layers of this, and we have to start with the thing I think that's easiest for employers to understand, and then start digging into the different layers. I don't think we can expect a leap from where we are now to the ideal around skills-based hiring in a short period of time. This is a journey we're going to have to commit to.
And I think too, the value add for employers too has to be, how does this ecosystem, whatever it is we create, allow me to find and search? So there's one is like, okay, I post a job and it's, we can set up how people can apply differently, right? They don't necessarily require to know that I have a degree or not. But then how do we create some sort of like, and some organizations are doing this, like Credential Engine, where we can make public the credentials and the skills and competencies, where as an employer, I can make better hiring decisions, or I know where to put my headquarters because I see that there's a lot of people with these skills in this area. So it's not just about any one job, for instance, but like, where are the talent pools? And obviously that's what the governors care about too, is like, how do we be a state that attracts like the headquarters of Toyota or whatever it may be? So I think creating like a marketplace where we understand kind of broadly, not just for I'm hiring for this position, but what's available and where the needs are. And then it just becomes, hey, let's collaborate with our community college. We have this gap. We need to stand up a micro-credential program or a certificate program that meets these needs, that type of thing. So, Amanda, I'll leave you with the last word. Anything we should know, and where can people learn more about the work that you're doing?
Yeah, certainly we have a bunch of stuff posted on our website at nga.org. We're continuing to engage deeply in this space. And really, I think what people need to know about the way in which we approach this work is we're never going to be the 100% expert on all of these topics. Our job is really to curate the space for states, to understand the big issues, the big questions, the opportunities that exist, and then bring a lot of partners alongside. So our work is centered on partnership. And it's sort of mine and my team's job to get out there and talk to people about, what are you offering to states? What's the technical assistance look like? What have you learned from some of your projects? Where do we need to lean in a bit? Where do states need to learn lessons from the private sector? Where can they get out ahead? So we're out there learning as NGA. So if folks have stuff that they want to share, my email's on the website. Just email me. I'll set up a time to talk. Because I really think that if we learn more, that supports better governors' offices getting the help they need quickly in order to implement the change they want to see. But then also, I think just positioning states as also talent pipeline developers and employers in this space, making sure we can sit at those tables and talk about good jobs together alongside with private sector.
So that is our episode on skills-based hiring and the initiatives that states are undertaking. Big thanks to Amanda Winters from the National Governors Association for joining us. The thing I love about Amanda, and I mentioned this at the outset, is that she's not just drinking the Kool-Aid of credentialing and all the things that are new. She has a critical eye towards some of this stuff and is thinking about the unintended consequences. Are we actually serving the people that we're intending to serve? How is this a door opener for economic mobility rather than closing doors, right? She mentioned the wages have gone down when they've removed the degree requirement, for instance. So how do we actually effectively create an ecosystem where this is creating positive opportunity for those that we're trying to serve? So really good conversation. Really appreciate her joining. Check out our other episodes. We've got ones on skills and competencies with Dr. Naomi Boyer, which tackles a lot of the same stuff from a different lens. So like and subscribe, and appreciate you listening. Hope it's been interesting and engaging for all of you as it is for me. Have a great one, and we'll talk to you all real soon.